So in addition to backing up files and folders, we have the ability to back up entire virtual machines, whether they're in the cloud or on-premise. There are multiple options that are going to be available to us. So we do have the Azure Backup. And as we talked about, Azure Backup, you would enable backup for individual Azure VMs. It then would run the or you can run the Mars agent within the VM. You can back up with MABS or DPM. Okay, so the way that was laid out was a little bit confusing. Let me rephrase. The first bullet point is actually a checkbox, right, in the portal where we can actually just enable backup for individual VMs. We could also alternatively install the Mars agent within a VM, or we could use MABS or DPM to back them up that way. Okay, and in that case, we don't have to do the agent. We've also got Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery can be configured for VMs to basically replicate the VM in its entirety to the cloud, stored in a recovery services vault, but you can quickly and very easily fail over and recover your application in a matter of minutes. So basically, the virtual machine is intact. The applications are intact in the cloud, but not being used. They are just incrementally updated. And then if and when you have a site failure, you decide to activate it, you can do that very quickly. In development and test environments, we can use snapshots. I mean, snapshots are a quick and simple way of backing up VMs when they're using managed disk. It's just a read-only full copy of the disk. But, they're not the greatest from a production standpoint. So typically we just see those being used, as I said, in development where, okay, I'm going to go make some changes to this application, but before I do so, I'm going to create a snapshot so that I could revert back to that snapshot easily if I needed to. And images are kind of the same concept. You can create what's called a managed custom image. So you can create an image from your VHDs and in a storage account, or you can create it directly from a VM that has had sysprep running on it. And so it captures that image, and then that image could be used to deploy to other VMs, so very quickly kind of restore. All right, so they're not the same things. They are different from one another, and neither of them, well, especially snapshots, we wouldn't really use in a production type of environment. In this demonstration, we're going to look at using Azure Backup for VMs that are in Azure. And so, kind of as we've seen, it's a little bit different just depending on what you are saying that you want to back up, but pretty straightforward. So you can do this a couple different ways. We can actually go to the backup vault. So we can go to the backup vault, and then we could just say, hey, I'm trying to do a backup, or excuse me, not there, but down here. Getting started. And then I could just say it's a virtual machine running in Azure, and then the next step is to click backup. So basically at this point, all we're doing is adding in the virtual machines that we want to affect. Okay, now you can do this at the virtual machine as well. But the nice thing here is I can create a policy and I can actually apply it to multiple VMs. So I'll leave default policy. We can see your settings there, the backup frequency and whatnot, and then we can add in the virtual machines that I want to back up. So I'm just going to say we're going to just back up my Windows 10 machine here. Okay. You can choose OS disk only. Notice it says there that allows you basically just the operating system, and it will exclude any of the additional disk. And then you click enable backup, and that's about it. It's going to create the policy. It's going to then apply the policy to those individual workstations, and then it will do backups based on the schedule that you have specified. Okay, and then once it is complete, we'll just say go to resource. The resource is going to take me back to the vault. I was just going to show you the other way. You can actually go, say, to the virtual machines. Where are we at here? How do we go? So you can go to the actual virtual machine and open it up. And we've got a lot in here. Okay, so we'll open up the virtual machine, and then down in some of the settings, you are going to have the option for backup, or under operations, I guess. Okay, and so here we can click backup. We can see what's happening, the recovery services vault, the policy. You would also get information about the backups here, okay, and the restore points that were available to you. So you can do the backup immediately. You can assign a policy here. I'm going to go ahead and do the backup and then just say this is how long we want to retain it. So it'll trigger the backup for this VM. But then notice across the top, we also see like restore VM, do file recovery, deleting old backup data, those kinds of things. This is that it's going, so we should be able to actually refresh. And not quite yet, but anyway, we'll be able to monitor the progress and we'll see when that is done. So as you can see, with actual VMs in Azure, the ability to back them up is fairly simplistic. In this demonstration, we're going to look at configuring a site recovery to Azure. Now, this is a bit more involved, and the idea is that you would be setting up site resiliency. So if you lost a site, then you could restore both physical and virtual machines from that site in Azure, and there's your disaster recovery, right? So it's an off-site complete system backup to the extent that you have virtual machines that are sitting idle in Azure but can be turned on at a moment's notice. We're actually going to do this from Recovery Services Vault, although you can go in and say, or you can just search for Azure Site Recovery. I say this is a bit more involved, and I'm actually just going to kind of talk us through some of this because I don't really have an on-prem server. I don't want to use a customer server because that can incur cost, even though it'd just be a little bit for setting it up. So I'm not going to do that. But we can see here we've got backup and we've got site recovery. So backups, the difference is you have actual restore points where you can restore a VM or you can restore a file, things like that, or the entire server if it's an on-prem workload. With site recovery, you're actually replicating an entire virtual machine. Okay, and then that virtual machine sits idle in the cloud until you need it. So if you have a failure that brings your site down, you can activate these VMs in the Azure cloud, and so then users can continue to access them. Okay, now to further complicate things, site recovery is actually what we would use to migrate cloud. Okay, so I've had projects where we were literally just setting up a backup, cloud-based backup with site recovery. I've also had projects where we were utilizing this to move a virtual machine to being in the cloud. Initially, they were done in the same way, but now they've kind of changed things a little bit. So before I say anything else, let's go to the site recovery dashboard. Okay, and then we're just going to hit that we want to enable site recovery. Okay, now this is where you immediately hit a fork in the road, okay? If it's Azure virtual machines, then it's easy. We just enable replication, and then we manage what are called recovery plans, and I suppose we could do that part. Basically that you're just replicating to a different region. I have done it with both VMware machines as well as Hyper-V machines, okay, and the process is going to be different. So your best bet is to click here, because it's going to take you to doing what you need to do. All right, so you just say, yes, I've done the deployment planning. Have to say that to go next. And then it says, okay, are the machines virtualized, yes or no? And if it's yes, then we're going to need to add a configuration server. And when I click on this, it says to download. Okay, so here is your key. Now this is VMware with ESXi server. They have an OVA although that says F now, but okay, that was OVA. But anyway, they have a template with a virtual machine. Here's the kicker. This virtual machine template requires that you have at least 600 gigabytes of space in the data store on ESXi. Okay, so I've run into issues and we've had to kind of do it manually. If you're able to download the virtual machine template for the config server, this is awesome because it does everything for you. It downloads it. You use it to create a VM. You start the thing up. Windows is already installed. It pops up basically an installation, a setup for the config server part of it. Does everything right there for you. All you need is your Azure credentials, and then you're going to be done. Okay. And then we would basically come back in and say we wanted to replicate individual machines. So what is this configuration server? Well, the configuration server is sort of like the middleman. It sits there and manages and monitors the replication from your on-prem VMs into the cloud. And it does need to remain. Okay, the only little gotcha here is that this thing needs to be licensed. So it's another server that you have to use to replicate your workloads to the cloud. Okay, so just that's that. The config server is there for VMware virtual machines. All right. If I click Hyper-V, if Hyper-V is my host and I hit to prepare infrastructure, I'm going to go, yes, I've done it again, and hit next. Okay. Now, are you using System Center VMM to manage your host? If I say no, notice I'm not adding a configuration server. Now I'm adding a Hyper-V site. Okay. And I would just, whatever, my site. Okay. It's going to create that. It's basically then going to scan your on-prem environment looking for a Hyper-V host. At this point, it's just kind of creating a site object. Okay. And then you select the Hyper-V site. No servers are found in the site. Okay. Whatever. Then we're just going to add a Hyper-V server. All right. Make sure it's running 2012 R2. Make sure it can communicate. Download the installer for the Azure Site Recovery Provider, and then a Vault registration key. So this is almost very similar to the Azure Backup. Okay. So I just want you to see that again. You don't have to go through every one of these steps. It really does walk you right through the process if you're doing this in real life, but it is different. It is different than, or depending on whether you have ESXi or Hyper-V. It's also different if you are actually trying to migrate. So no longer do we actually do this for migration. Now they have a component called Azure Migrate. And Azure Migrate is specific to getting workloads, whether they're physical or virtual workloads, in an on-prem data center into the cloud and running in the cloud. Okay? Site recovery is for a backup that you can activate if need be. Azure Migrate is to move. Now, I said back in the day that we did the things the same. It didn't matter which one you were doing. You still used Azure Site Recovery. So this is actually a good division. It's nice that they separated them. So Azure Migrate would be something different. It's technically behind the scenes going to do a very similar thing, and that is replicate the VM in its entirety. So, we'll have to, it's doing the same thing behind the scenes, but it is a different component. So all of that to say, hopefully that helps. Hopefully it's not confusing. With Azure VMs, we're just doing backup, or we can do site recovery to a different region. With VMware VMs, we're doing site recovery with a required configuration server. And then with Hyper-V, it's a smaller just installer that allows us to detect the Hyper-V host and then see all the VMs. In either of those last two cases, once you have the config server in place or the installer in place, then you're going to go back in, you're going to select, I want this VM replicated, this VM replicated, and walk through that process. So hopefully that helps. Just kind of show us what's going on with Azure Site Recovery.